What's going on, people? My name is Batman, and today I wanted to take a look at some new DLC areas that have been glitched into, areas that were present in the original game files and on disc, but were locked off and are presumably going to be unlocked for an extra $20. And what's interesting this time around is that it's House of Wolves content, which means that the developers at Bungie had made significant progress before the release of the base game on DLC that isn't supposed to drop until 6 months after the release of that base game. So here are the areas that were glitched into. Before I show the House of Wolves stuff, I thought it was also worth mentioning that the Crota's End Raid from the Dark Below DLC was actually on disc as well before the Dark Below was released. It was mistaken for the Chamber of Night, but regardless, it was there. If you YouTube search Chamber of Night, you'll find plenty of videos on it that date back as early as October, maybe even earlier, long before the DLC had that initial update that precedes its actual launch. It was on the disc, it was in the game files. We know this game could have shipped with 2 raids, but it chose not to. Which is frustrating because, again, for all of us who have had a low opinion of this game, what's usually driving that low opinion is the fact that there really isn't that much content, there isn't that much to do. The majority of the game involves repeating the things you've already done. But if this second raid had not only been on the disc, but playable on the disc, that could have dramatically changed my opinion for the better. But of course, these days there isn't necessarily more money to be made in me liking the game more. And so, on top of that, we have these 2 areas from the House of Wolves, the Dusk Warrens and the Traitors Ketch, fully texturized, built, and they even have the dead ghost set up in there already, as has been the case with all of these areas we've found tucked away in the game files. The only thing these DLC areas that get glitched into are ever missing is the front door and the enemies spawned in. Period. This content was finished. And if they already had House of Wolves content finished before the game had even released. And on top of that, knowing that the second strike in that DLC, the PlayStation exclusive strike, was just on the Black Garden map going backwards, and knowing that they felt comfortable enough to begin working on that second DLC, I think it's safe to say that the entirety of the first DLC, The Dark Below, was completed before the game was even released. And in fact, I would bet the entirety of the House of Wolves is finished as well. They've only discovered 2 areas from it thus far, but as time goes on, I bet you some clever people will glitch into other potential areas as well. And if there are any other areas that you know of, I encourage you to share the details in the comments below. But the question we have to ask is this: assuming they chose to cut this content out of the game, how could a lower quality product with less content and a broken story, and I'm assuming the story was broken at this point, I'm assuming it was broken specifically because they decided to cut that content out of the game. I believe that's the only explanation that really makes sense at this point, is that they saw an opportunity to make more money by cutting this content out of the game, and they decided that that took priority over a high quality story. So how could a lower quality product with less content and a pathetic story make more money? How is hurting the quality of your product translate into a net gain in your profits? That's the question I really want to elaborate in this video. I want to look at the business strategy behind this. So it used to be that the best way to make higher profits was to sell to more and more customers, to sell your product to as many customers as possible. And so the best way to bring in new customers was to have the highest quality product possible, at the lowest price possible, to beat out your competitors. And under that set of rules, the consumer always wins. But I don't think Destiny had to play under that set of rules. For one, because Destiny basically launched unopposed. The 2 biggest games to launch in its same release window were Shadow of Mordor and Forza Horizon 2. Those were its big competitors back then in September. Outside of that, its biggest competitor for the entire year as a whole is probably going to be Call of Duty, which is being published and ruled over by the same company, Activision. Now that by itself leads to some other serious problems, but before we can dive into those, we have to first understand the biggest problem with how little competition Destiny had to face at launch. When there's zero competition, it doesn't have to worry about being the best game or being a better game. It had the market by the balls. It only has to focus on being a game that is good enough not to get returned. Every company's basic goal is to generate as much revenue as possible. Now, had Destiny released side by side with, say, Grand Theft Auto, then it would have had to fight tooth and nail for as much market share, for as many customers as possible. That fight would have been won with higher quality games, and with that in mind, here's something I've actually been thinking about a lot lately. What if Destiny had released side by side with GTA 5? Because GTA 5 was released in the exact same time slot, that September time slot, maybe even in the exact same week, but 1 year earlier. There would have been a considerable amount of time, however, during the development of both these games before each game had announced its release date, in which I'm sure Activision was concerned that they might have to go head-to-head with GTA 5, because for all they knew, before the release dates had actually been announced, GTA 5 might very well have ended up releasing in the same year as Destiny, because they were just 1 year apart. And they both had like these, 5 or 6 year long development periods, which would mean it would release in the exact same time slot, probably within 1 week of each other, kind of like how you see with COD and Battlefield. Now, had that been the case, I am quite certain Activision would have unlocked the Dark Below and the House of Wolves, and Destiny would have launched with 3 raids and 8 strikes as opposed to 1 raid and 4 strikes. Because if it hadn't unlocked those things to compete with GTA 5, it would have been fucking stomped on by GTA 5, because GTA 5 shoves as much content as possible into their game because they only release like twice a decade. And had Destiny launched the same way with all the negative publicity and lackluster reviews, GTA 5 would have cut into Destiny's sales and playtime significantly. It would have destroyed Destiny. However, had GTA 5 gone up against Destiny when Destiny was launching with 3 raids and 8 strikes, it would have been a fierce competition. Nobody would be complaining about a lack of content in Destiny, and having retained all that extra content in the main game, I imagine they probably wouldn't have had to butcher the story so completely. It would neutralize the 2 biggest complaints people have about this game, its story and lack of content, and it would have been an incredible matchup between 2 titans of the industry. But that was not the case. GTA 5 announced their release date for 2013. Now, we know, as I've gone over in past videos, there's some evidence to suggest that a lot of these changes Destiny went through that we think caused its problems, these changes took place in its final year of development. Is it possible that once Activision figured out they were going to launch essentially unopposed in 2014, that they started scaling back the amount of content in-game in order to repackage it as DLC for extra profit, knowing that they wouldn't face any meaningful penalty for it because there was no competition there? They could water their game down and make it as shitty as possible, and it wouldn't necessarily cause them a significant problem because there was no one there to take their place. There was no one there to beat them out for the customers. Now, I admit that's speculative, but regardless, because there was no competition, the question stops being how do we bring in as many customers as possible, but instead becomes how do we make as much money as possible off of the customers we are guaranteed. Because Destiny knew that it was going to sell to the vast majority of console gamers. There hadn't been a major FPS in quite some time. First-person shooters, as you all know, are always the most popular and sought-after games among console gamers. Destiny had no competition, and on top of that, an aggressive marketing campaign, unprecedented in its size and scope and cost. All these factors combined to give Destiny its impressive sales figures regardless of its quality, right? Destiny is this best-selling title that got multiple 6 out of 10 reviews. That's what happens when there's no competition. And so the question you have to ask, and that I'm sure Activision asked, is this: if Destiny had unlocked the entirety of the House of Wolves and the Dark Below and made them both playable from launch, if they had supersized the amount of content in-game by unlocking all the content we have since found on disc, would it have significantly boosted sales? I don't think it would have, because they didn't need to. It'd be like a runner running a race unopposed. Would that runner feel inclined to buy expensive running shoes that might help him win the race that much faster, even if he doesn't need them to win because he's already guaranteed the win? No, probably not. Because the question consumers were asking wasn't, do I want this game or that game? It was, do I want a new FPS or don't I? They weren't asking, is that game better than that game? They were asking, do I want a new game? Perhaps the better question would be, how many would-be sales did Destiny miss out on because of its lack of content? I don't think very many at all. For one, because it took a while, I think about a month, for people to realize how little content there actually was and how much of the gameplay boiled down to monotonous repetition and grinding. And Destiny did get fucking wrecked in the reviews, but not that many people actually look at reviews. I mean, this game's sales, I'm sure, currently hover between 10 and 20 million, while the most popular review is probably Angry Joe's, which has 4 million views total. The GameSpot review has under 1 million views, and I'm sure plenty of those views are duplicate views from the same people, either rewatching it or returning to the video for some argument or conversation in the comments, and I would bet that the majority of the people who saw those reviews already owned the game when they saw them. For the typical consumer, this was a major FPS they'd heard a lot about, because if you were involved in gaming at any level, you definitely heard a lot about this game even months before it was released, whether it was on YouTube or in television ads or in your Facebook feed or on the dashboard of your game console. And of course, it did look really fucking cool in its advertising pre-release. They probably had quite a few friends playing it, and the amount of friends you have on a game always plays a huge role in whether or not you get it. If they had heard negative things about it, they probably were relatively benign criticisms, such as it gets repetitive repetitive, and I'm sure there was praise for parts of the game to counterbalance some of the criticism. And to be fair, there are still things to be praised in the game, such as its multiplayer and its shooter mechanics and graphics, and if they were bored of the games they already had, if they wanted a new FPS, they went ahead and bought Destiny, because at the end of the day, there weren't many other games to buy, and there was certainly no shooter directly competing with Destiny at the time, and I'm sure they probably just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Now, I'm sure there were still some sales Destiny missed out on because of the game's overall shortcomings and the negative reception those shortcomings garnered, whether in reviews or in my YouTube videos or whatever. But keep in mind, if those shortcomings, the lack of content and repetition, were a symptom of Activision's efforts to milk the player base they already had, then those sales they missed out on because of those shortcomings did not necessarily amount to more profit than the profits earned from milking the player base, which of course caused and required the initial shortcomings to begin with. There was more money to be had in sacrificing new customers so that they could further milk the player base they already had. And we know Activision is fine with sacrificing extra sales in order to appease the player base they already have, because that's exactly what they did when they refused to launch Destiny on PC. I'm sure there were a few million sales to be had on PC, but as I've talked about before, they were worried about console gamers being turned off by the fact that they were getting the lesser product because the graphics were so much superior on PC, and because of YouTube these days, the contrast would always be on full display. And that's why Watch Dogs nerfed its graphics on the PC, that's why Assassin's Creed Unity nerfed its graphics on the PS4, so as not to offend Xbox players. And the Assassin's Creed developers have been fully upfront and open about that fact in interviews. I linked to that article, I believe, in the description of that first Destiny DLC video, but developers have been open about this fact. They've talked about that. I'm not just pulling this out of my ass. Activision calculated that sacrificing sales on the PC was worth it so long as they kept the bulk of their audience on the consoles pleased, because that's who they really want to milk, and of course that's where the much larger sales pool is to be acquired. So the extra sales they might have won if they had neutralized the lack of content and butchered story criticisms were not worth more than the extra profit they are going to make off of cutting that content out of the game and reselling it as DLC with zero extra production costs for the first 2 DLC packs. Selling $40 worth of content to the millions of players they already have, $40 worth of content that it cost them $0 extra to build, because it had already been built, because all they did was cut it out of the main game, was much more profitable than the few million extra sales they might have seen had they unlocked all that on-disc content from the beginning. And something else I've actually been thinking about lately, perhaps they were worried from the beginning that we would find out about the locked content, and that was why they didn't release it on PC as well. Had it been on PC, someone probably would have discovered every single piece of locked content within like 24 hours of it launching. Now, in a perfect economy, even when they had this kind of quasi-monopoly, what would happen then is that they would not aggressively try to increase their own market share, but to increase the size and reach of the market itself, period. If you look at Halo or Call of Duty, both of which have had a similar sort of, brief release date monopoly at one time or another, as Destiny had this year, those are two franchises that in their prime dramatically increased the size of not only their market share, but of how many consumers were involved in the gaming industry, period. Right? Call of Duty and Halo, there are huge amounts of players, of gamers today, who started on those games and who have sort of stayed in the industry, progressed onto different games, whatever. But that was some time ago, and because of those two franchises, the industry has exploded and grown much larger and faster than I think anyone had ever anticipated. And because of that, the economic landscape and opportunities are much different now than they once were. There is a serious problem with first world modern economies in the West right now, and that is that they've hit a market share cap. They have reached all the possible customers they can reach while still turning a profit on each said customer, and it's affected many industries, generally the ones whose products involve a high amount of physical capital, that is stuff, because the bigger your product is, like a TV, the more expensive it's going to end up being to ship millions of it across the ocean. Now Hollywood isn't having any problems getting movies across the oceans because they just have to transport the movie file itself, which can be done digitally over the frickin' internet, frickin' Facebook message, which is very cheap obviously. And in theory, games would be able to overcome the market cap barrier as well with digital download, but of course the problem is they can only sell to people who have bought expensive game consoles or computers. And there are a lot of people in this world, a lot of would-be potential customers, but the stark reality is that most of them are still very poor. For instance, India. India has more potential customers than the United States and Europe combined. But India still has a very serious poverty problem. One of their big political debates the past few years has revolved around what to do with the huge fraction of their population that doesn't even have toilets, and thus they have to shit in fields or streets. And they do, and it smells, and it's sort of awkward. It's a huge public sanitation and health problem. So they can't afford toilets, thus you can imagine how few people in India can afford a game console and games, and the same level of poverty and general market inaccessibility is true for Africa, the Middle East, those Asian nations which are still developing, and I guess nowadays even fucking Russia. So not only would Microsoft or Sony have to spend a fuck ton of money shipping millions of consoles over there, they'd also have to hike the price because the nation's money is worth significantly less while it costs significantly more to get the consoles over there. And even if the prices hadn't been hiked, the majority of their population still wouldn't be able to afford that shit in the first place because they have serious poverty rates, not to mention language barriers which can be very difficult for products to overcome, and foreign governments who don't necessarily encourage the spread of Western markets like Russia, the Middle East, and China to an extent. So consoles and the high-end PCs necessary for quality gaming are not widely available outside of the US, Western Europe, and Australia. And thus, games are capped on the amount of customers they can reach, because until globalization brings the rest of the world up to economic speed, assuming it can at all, they are restricted to those markets. They can't grow outside of those markets, and at this point, they've essentially maxed out their growth within those markets, right? Call of Duty's peak was 28 million. No game has been able to hit that number since, and that's sort of the cap. You know, they can pour as much money as they could put $1 billion into advertising for one game. They're not going to see a return in terms of more sales because they've reached all the people they can reach. They are out of potential gamers to sell games to. Destiny had skyscraper-sized banners in New York, it had posters in bus stops in San Francisco, it had television commercials airing across continents, it was on the PlayStation and Xbox homepages, not to mention all the aggressive love and hype it got online on YouTube and Facebook and everything else. Anyone who this game could be sold to, it was sold to. And as I was talking about, they could have made this the most epic masterpiece of all time, but because of this market cap problem, combined with how little competition they face, it would not have dramatically increased sales. A higher quality game would not have achieved a higher return of profit. And knowing that, the more money they poured into creating a better game, the less profit they would turn in the end, because they would not have seen profitable returns on the money spent making it a better game, because people would have bought it anyways, and there aren't new customers to reach regardless. So we've reached this point where, because of this Western economy cap problem, the higher quality product is no longer generating the most profit. So I think Activision did what basically every company has done that is adversely affected by the fact that they've run out of new markets to capitalize on. They found inventive ways to cut costs. This is something I think it's important more people understand. Because industries are having a harder and harder time reaching new customers, because the prospects of new markets opening up has been seriously delayed by the Great Recession, a recession that it in fact looks like Europe might dip back into, the easiest way to turn a profit is no longer to boost revenue, but to cut costs. And in fact, even before the struggles of growth caps due to limited market availability, cutting costs was always an efficient and easy way to boost profits. And actually, a good example of this that many of you probably heard about during the 2012 elections is Mitt Romney's company, Bain Capital. And I'm not commenting at all on the politics of it, I'm not trying to say whether it was good or bad or any of that. But Bain Capital's basic function was to buy a company, dramatically increase its profitability, and then sell the company at a profit. And the companies that were bought and sold always varied greatly in their products and services, right? So Mitt Romney wasn't going into each one of those companies and increasing their profit margins by figuring out how to make a better product or deliver a better service, because then he'd have to be an expert in like a million different crafts ranging from food to basketballs, right? He wasn't going into restaurants and figuring out what the best tri-tip sandwich was to serve. He wasn't figuring out what the best type of basketball was to sell to people. Those profit margins increased because he was a master of cutting costs. Now, the reason it was somewhat controversial during the elections was that cutting costs most of the time involved aggressively reducing staff, which meant firing people. And Bain Capital was an extremely lucrative enterprise specifically because so many companies are faced with this problem where they've hit a sort of ceiling and the only avenue left to boost revenue is by cutting costs, which is the boat that I suspect most of the gaming industry finds itself in currently, and especially the major first-person shooters, because those are the biggest games. Those are the games that really have, gotten into every home. And I also think this might explain all the shitty botched launches in the last few years. I think many of these development studios may be trying to operate with the smallest staff size possible at the bare minimum expense, and then having that staff overwhelmed and defeated, unequipped and unprepared when it comes time to sort out unexpected launch issues. When you're operating on, just the bare minimum budget that you need to succeed, everything has to go perfectly, or because you have no sort of cushion to deal with problems that may arise. So if you're operating with the smallest staff possible and the fucking flu comes through LA and wipes out half your studio, boom, now you're either gonna have to launch a fucked up game or miss your deadline altogether. Now, another great way to reduce costs besides operating on a minimal budget, minimal staff, the best way in fact, would be to release 2 expansion packs without having to spend any extra resources to have those expansion packs developed, which is exactly what I think has happened with Destiny. And I don't think it's something they would have been able to do had they faced any actual competition this year. And of course, to further reduce costs, you can find clever ways to release new content that isn't in fact very new at all, such as that PlayStation exclusive strike, which takes place entirely on a map that's already been built for the most part, and of course a game itself where a majority of the actual playtime is spent replaying the same content over and over again, but with minor modifications. If you look at all of Destiny's PvE gameplay, they probably have 10 hours max of content on that game. But through a very clever progression system, they're able to drag that out for a ridiculous amount of time. And that's a clever way to make money while cutting costs. And of course, the more they can recycle content already developed, the less content they have to actually build, the more time they will have to ensure the little content they do have to build launches smoothly while retaining the bare minimum amount of staff, which is a feat that only Activision has been able to pull off this far without a botched launch. Call of Duty and Destiny are the 2 major games that don't have some major launch stain right now. And coincidentally, I would argue both those games also have the least amount of content available. If you look at Battlefield 4 and Halo MCC, both of which had terrible launches, and I criticized them both heavily when they launched, but you can't help but notice the massive amount of content that is stuffed into each one of those games. I mean, both those games have a supersized amount of content in them. And you compare that to Destiny and Call of Duty, well, Destiny and Call of Duty, they launched smoothly, but I mean, not even a fifth of the amount of content that you'll find in the MCC or Battlefield 4. Now, they've confirmed that they've already begun working on Destiny 2. By the time Destiny 2 comes out, they'll be working on Destiny 3. And in the long run, using this strategy, they'll probably end up cutting out years' worth of development costs. And the financial strategy is this perfect masterpiece. But unfortunately, the game is only a 6 out of 10 shadow of the masterpiece it could have been. And what everyone needs to understand going forward is that if Destiny pulls this off, if they generate significantly more revenue off of an intentionally watered down product, then other games will follow suit, and watered down, stripped bare, oversimplified games are going to become the standard, if they haven't already. I know you are all aware of the effect Call of Duty has had on the industry as a whole, but the FPS genre especially, and it's not just games copying its mechanics like with Halo 4, it's more than that. They are all aggressively trying to implement the same business tactics as well, primarily annualizing their franchises. And as other franchises annualize, they are plagued by the exact same problems that COD has because of annualization. Primarily the complete absence of meaningful innovation. People's severe lack of enthusiasm about Battlefield Hardline is largely due to Hardline not having any meaningful improvements or additions over Battlefield 4, and thus feeling like it should have been Battlefield 4 DLC, and those problems are a direct result of Battlefield trying to copy COD's business model of annualization, and of course COD's game mechanics like second chance in Battlefield. I mean, what the fuck, whoever thought we'd see that day. And this aggressive thirst for annualization is also what I think is leading to so many rushed and broken launches, such as with Battlefield 4. The terrible direction Battlefield has taken in the last 2 years while chasing COD's success is a perfect example of how the success of one game's shitty business model can infect and degrade the quality of other games you love. I know personally former COD players who eventually abandoned COD for Battlefield because they were unhappy with the oversimplified and recycled direction COD was taking, but now Battlefield has adopted that same oversimplified and recycled direction. Now, we've seen Halo basically annualize as well, right? I mean, if you count in the anniversary releases, Halo is practically annualized at this point. And wouldn't you know it, people's complaints with Halo now are starting to look a lot like the same complaints we hear about Call of Duty. And just as we've seen every game copy COD's annual strategy and import all the same problems COD has because of that strategy, so too will we see every game adopt the Destiny tactic of stripping a game to its bare minimum in order to ship more and more DLC for extra profit. If Destiny pulls off this heist with no tangible PR backlash, it will set a precedent. Destiny will continue to employ this strategy, and other games will follow suit just to compete. Imagine what it would be like if this business strategy had been discovered back in 2009. What if Black Ops 1 had shipped with only Kino der Toten as its Zombies map, and then you had to pay extra money for the Zombies map 5 and Dead Ops Arcade? If Destiny succeeds in this, we are looking at a future where you, the consumer, are spending more and more money for less and less content. Public opinion will decide the fate of this game, and I'm not one to see it personally, like, I hate Bungie and I'm never touching their shit again. I think of this kind of like, something my football coaches used to say a lot is, when we stop yelling at you, that's when you should be concerned, because when we've stopped yelling at you, that's when we've given up on you being better. Nobody loved Destiny more than I did before it released. And if I seem like a hater, I promise you, it is driven by disappointment. Now, I expect them to do what is going to make them the most money, but my goal ultimately is to carve a path forward using public opinion in which we can merge some common ground between their profits and a higher quality product. That's sort of my mission statement as a YouTuber. I want to do my best to shape public opinion. And that's not to say that I am the master of YouTube public opinion. I only play a minor role. It will take a lot more than me to affect real change. It will take as many gamers as possible, bitching as often as possible. But I can make more noise than the typical individual, and the channels that could make more noise than me don't bother to. Except for like Total Biscuit, that guy's awesome. And the line has to be drawn at the most popular top games, because those are the games that all the smaller games will try to imitate. Whoever's on top sets the standard for what practices ought to be employed in this industry. Again, we've seen how in the last 5 years, almost every game, or at least every major FPS, has tried to copy Call of Duty in one way or another. If that happens again, with this cut content being repackaged as DLC strategy, the games we love are going to get really lame and really fast. And we're talking about a future, again, where we are paying more and more money for less and less content. That is the future we are faced with here, and that is what we should be concerned about. And if you are concerned about it, I hope you will support the video and the cause with a like, and may the force be with you. And this is Batman, signing out.